president of the, got it. President of the DC Lera chapter, and we're being hosted from the University of Illinois today, where Lera National is headquartered, with our stalwart supporters, Bernadette Tiemann and Emily Smith. And today we are on the third of 4 presentations we have in late September, October, on the return to work topic, which is being co-sponsored with the U.S.-Canada Office of the International Labor Organization. So we want to really do a shout out to Kevin Cassidy and Andrea Cuba-Sanchez for their support of these events. We had Tom Barkin from the Federal Reserve Board, Richmond. We had Harold Meyerson on Wednesday. We've got Dan Pedrotty today, and we've got Chantel Sheeks and Mark Friedman on next Wednesday from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So we're covering kind of a span of viewpoints on where we're at in the economy today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator for today, Professor Steve and Silvia, who is also the treasurer for the DC Lera chapter. And Steve, it's all yours. And Dan, thank you so much for joining us. And I'll probably come back on close around 12:58 or so, just to say that we've got to wrap it up. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks a lot, Steve. I'm Steve Silvia. I teach at American University here in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome everybody to today's presentation organized by the District of Columbia chapter of the Labor and Employment Research Association. The title of today's talk is A Seat at the Table, White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment. And we're fortunate to have with us today Dan Pedrotty, who was staff director of the White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment, and a labor policy advisor to Vice President Kamala Harris. Dan was and is, once again, Director of Capital Strategies for North America's Building Trades Unions. Prior to that, he served as Director of Capital Strategies for the American Federation of Teachers, and earlier in his career, he worked as a research associate for the Initiative for Responsible Investment at Harvard University, and director of the AFL-CIO's Office of Investment. Dan grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and he currently resides in the Cleveland area. And he earned a BA from Dickinson College and a JD from Wake Forest University. So to kick things, Dan's going to do a presentation, but before that, to kick things off, I thought I'd just show everybody something that I found very interesting. And back in June of 2019, back in the before times, I was doing some research at the UAW archives at the Walter Reuther Library at Wayne State University in Detroit. And I was doing research on the UAW's efforts to organize foreign car plants. And the archivists haven't managed to organize the papers of some of the later UAW presidents. So they just said, okay, you can just go through the stack. We trust you. And so I was there, I was going through the stack of Ron Gettelfinger's paper, and I found the following letter, which I took a picture of. And this is a letter from Joe Biden to Ron Gettelfinger, which I think, I'm not going to read it because I can't do a Biden imitation, but I'll give everybody a little chance to read it. The part that I love about the letter is the last sentence. You can just hear Biden saying, "You guys are great, man." So it's something that I think would be useful on, because there's been a lot of commentary about Joe Biden being the most pro-union president that we've ever had. And I don't know how many other honorary memberships he has in unions, but at least we know he's an honorary member of the UAW. Okay, I'll turn things over now to Dan. Dan will give us a presentation, and then Then we'll open things up for questions.
Thank you, Professor Silvia. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for what you guys do in terms of thought leadership and convening these conversations. Thank you to my friend and colleague, Steve Slay, who I'm proud to have known and worked with now for maybe 15 years, Steve, dating us both. I'm excited to talk to you today because the focus of this conversation is a task force that really gets to the heart of what Professor Silvia just showed, in that, you know, both President Biden and Vice President Harris have repeatedly said they want to be the most pro-union administration in our nation's history. And I think, you know, before joining the Vice President's office, I worked in labor for about 17 years. And I think it's, you know, it's a little disorienting for labor unions to have an administration on the Democratic side that's so focused on rebuilding union density in the middle class. But that's the standard that the Vice President and the President have set themselves to. And I think that the task force is really one focal point to get them there, to get us there. But let me just give you some background on the task force itself, the goals of the task force and some meetings that we've had. And then also just finish by talking more broadly about labor in society and labor in the economy. Some quick background on the task force itself. President Biden signed an executive order creating the task force on April 26, 2021. And the formal name of the task force is White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment. The executive order that he signed directed the task force, which is chaired by the vice president. The vice chair is Marty Walsh, the labor secretary, and then it includes 20 other cabinet departments and agencies. Excuse me, I think the only cabinet departments and agencies that aren't a part of the task force are both state and justice. Every other department has both the department, you know, the secretary of the department and also a staff liaison. But the executive order directed the task force to deliver a report to the president 180 days from the signing of the order. So that 180 days arrives next Saturday, October 23rd. So this is a timely moment to be having the conversation, that a lot of the focal points of the recommendations are done and being written. But the order really asked for two things coming out of the task force work. The first is, how can existing federal policies, programs, and practices be used to promote worker organizing and collective bargaining? That was focus number one. Focus number two is, what are new policies needed to achieve the task force's mission and the associated regulatory and statutory changes? And I assume most folks on the call have followed the debate and the legislative arc of the PRO Act. That's obviously at the center of new policies that are going to be necessary. So with that, let me talk about the task force goals. And there were really four that jumped out for us, or where we spent most of our time and effort in organizing labor and getting labor's input. The first goal was what we call the low-hanging fruit, was to lead by example on behalf of the federal government. And the vice president mentioned this a lot, and that the federal government as an employer is the largest employer in the United States. There are, I think, about 2.2 million non-military, 2.2 million federal employees. And just to give you a sense of that universe of 2.2 million folks, about 1.25 million are represented by unions, are in the bargaining unit of a union. But in terms of low-hanging fruit, if you kind of break that group of 1.25 million down even further, there are 835,000 workers in the federal government across all those departments who are in the bargaining unit, but are not union members. So one of the focal points of the government till now and going forward is going to be communicating with those workers. My brother-in-law is actually one. He's a GSA member who somehow don't feel like the union is speaking to them, doing achieving what they want to see happen in the workplace. And they're not seeing the kind of leading by example, top-down voice in favor of labor as well. So, you know, in terms of meaningfully moving the needle on the federal government, if we were able to just get, you know, a quarter of that 835,000 group of workers who aren't in the union now into the union, I think that would really meaningfully move the dial. The other areas around leading by example included, and we heard this loud and clear from labor. So we had, in the second or third week of the task force, we had convened meetings with unions kind of broken out by industry, transportation, entertainment, public employees, where we brought the right or relevant cabinet agencies and departments together to hear from the unions in that jurisdiction. And one of the things we kept hearing loud and clear from that group was, from the labor side, was they don't have unfettered access to federal property in order to be able to communicate with culinary workers or engineers or the like. And obviously there's some security concerns, but in many cases they were cut off from being able to speak to workers or organize workers. And that was definitely one focal point or one recommendation from them in terms of improving labor relations. The departments who were also on the task force, got started on their own as well and developed some new practices or restored practices that had been undone by the Trump administration. And so at the DOL, for instance, they reinstated something called walk-around rights, meaning when OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, shows up on a job site, typically workers who aren't in a union, if they don't have walk-around rights, can't accompany that OSHA representative to show them where there are safety hazards or practices where they're cutting corners on safety and health. And that really that example of a worker being able to walk side by side with the OSHA representative, I think, is a form of collective action, is a form of workers standing up. And that was something the DOL restored that I thought was important to, again, demonstrate to non-union workers the power of a union. Some others on the task force, transportation, for instance, focused on a local hire initiative. The Department of Energy was doing a lot of work around union job creation in clean energy. And then the National Economic Council really led with something, one of the first executive orders, the Made in America executive order, which is meaningful from where I sit in the American Midwest in really trying to insource a lot of jobs in manufacturing in our country. So that was the first goal of task force, lead by example. The second was facilitate worker organizing around the country. And by that we meant, really get out into the field and hear from workers, hear from labor about their experience in trying to organize unions and some of the impediments they faced. So back in June, on June 21st, the Vice President and Secretary Walsh from Labor convened the first field hearing of the Worker Task Force, where they met at an IBEW, electrical worker training facility. They met with union organizers who were on the front lines of organizing workers across industries. So we had 8 unions represented: service employees, steel workers, electrical workers, teachers, culinary workers, laborers, communications workers, and UFCW, meaning the food and commercial workers. And the real standout report or standout moment from that meeting for me was a young Asian American worker named Jen Chow, who had flown in from San Francisco. And she was in week 2 or 3 of organizing tech workers at a company called Mapbox in San Francisco. And she said, I just have a couple of quotes from her here, because she said this very emotionally in the meeting, and me reading this to you won't do justice to it. If you can find the video, or I'll send around the link to the video, I think it's even more meaningful. But she was talking about about how hard and difficult and scary it is to organize a union in a workplace today, particularly a tech company. And she said, here's her quote: "People understand the inequality we face across teams and states. However, we're afraid that our leadership will come at us. Maybe they can't fire us directly, but they can isolate us. I was even afraid to tell my coworkers that I was coming to talk with you, Vice President Harris, directly today." And I think, we've seen that same culture of fear and intimidation in other organizing drives as well. So the Vice President asked her, why is it that you decided that you needed a union now? And here was her response. She said, hearing that as a first-generation student, my mom's a single parent, I made less than my coworkers because they're white males and went to Stanford or Berkeley. It doesn't make me less than them. I'm just as good as they are. So she was really, I think that for me, for the folks in the room, for the Vice President and Secretary Walsh, the sort of shining example of a worker and a industry that has really been left behind in terms of worker voice and empowerment. And she, I think, made the case pretty forcefully around the need for new policies, which again was one of the areas of recommendations for the report. So that was the first big focal point of this field hearing. The second was in Pittsburgh, of all places, there were a group of Google workers, Google contractors, who had organized a union at Google through their, even though they worked for a contractor of Google Marketplace, and the contractor's name was HCL. And it won't, I think, shock anyone on this call to hear that the workers who organized into the United Steelworkers, which are headquartered in Pittsburgh, even though the workers voted to join a union in September of 2019, almost 2 years before, fast forward to June of 2021, they still did not have a contract yet. And I think, one of the areas the vice president was really interested in learning more about was, both for the federal government and who the federal government contracts with, and obviously Google is a big federal government contractor, what percentage of their workforce is made up of temps or contractors or folks who aren't direct employees. And we were able to just for Google here learn from the steelworkers that about over half of their workers, over 51% of their 170,000 workers, are temps, vendors, and contractors. So these folks who in their Pittsburgh office of Google Marketplace work alongside Google employees are more of the norm than the exception. And so the vice president and Secretary Walsh met with 3 workers from this union who were organized in September of 19. And what they said loud and clear was that they not only felt, as you would expect, disrespected as contractors, as sort of second-class citizens, but they wanted a voice at work because there was no transparency for them around things like promotions and pay and benefits, like vacation. And that even within the contractor world, even within HCL, their contractor, their pay varied for really no good reason. One example they pointed us to was there was a $30,000 pay gap between 2 employees doing the same job with the same tenure. So, I think that was also meaningful in looking at sort of the new economy companies and again, the tech kind of Silicon Valley world at workers who were standing up for their rights and exercising their voice. The 2 other focal points of the task force are 3 and 4: increase worker power in underserved communities, meaning farm workers, domestic workers. The vice president met with Ai-jen Poo from the National Domestic Workers yesterday in a meeting. And she was also, I think, in looking at farm workers, really focused on things like a heat standard for farm workers, where they have very little protections under the National Labor Relations Act. Immigration issues, the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which she co-sponsored when she was in the Senate. And lastly, the last focal point of the task force was increasing union membership, just full stop. That was increasing union density was a kind of North Star. And that's where I wanted to sort of close and say, what are the reasons that is a good in and of itself? And again, realizing as a guy who's worked in the labor movement for 17 years, I've got a point of view here. But I think this goes to the sort of larger resonance of labor in society. And what we were able to really dig in around and sort of communicate and see in the field when the vice president would visit a training center that was training local workers to become apprentices and get good jobs in the building trades, or go to a water treatment facility and talk to workers who are going to be part of this infrastructure update, that when a society or a city or a state has a strong labor movement, from a social mobility standpoint in terms of the public good, that there's a strong correlation in research between union membership and intergenerational mobility, meaning that areas like Ohio with higher union membership have more mobility for low-income children than areas with low union membership. And Professor Silvia mentioned I went to law school at Wake Forest. I think North Carolina has the unfortunate designation as the state with the lowest union density in the country. But also that union rights are civil rights as well. That there's another empirical body of research that shows unions play an important role in shrinking the Black-white pay gap. From an inequality standpoint, we know that, and this is from the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, that deunionization is a big part of the story around the growth and explosion of inequality. And they were able to even sort of give a window for women. They think it's between 13 and 20% of the rise of inequality is linked to labor's weakness, and then between 33 and 37% for men. And one of the other pieces of research that EPI done was to look at union density in the late 70s, when there was the last one of the last big pushes to update labor law. If the union density rate was today what it was back in the late 70s, they're estimating, because of the loss of density, EPI said working people are losing $200 billion a year because of the erosion of union coverage over the last 4 decades, with a lot of that money, of course, being redistributed upward. So, the day-to-day work that I do in the labor movement is with pension funds and promoting good investments and responsible investments, both so workers have a secure retirement, but we also can create good jobs. That links again to labor's role in promoting secure retirement benefits, safer working conditions, and then again, just more take-home pay per week. It amounts to $191 more a week is earned by union members than non-union members. So with that, I'll stop talking. Would love to hear from you all, take your questions, and really dig into any part of this or the larger debate underway. And again, appreciate the invitation.
Thanks a lot, Dan. That's fascinating. It's very helpful, your presentation, and to find out what's going on. One thing I do want to do is encourage people to ask questions. You can do it either by raising your hand, hit the in the reactions icon down at the bottom. If you hit raise your hand, then you can ask your question, or you can write it in the chat box. Either way, it'd be great, but these are best when we get as broad participation as possible. But while people are thinking of questions, I do have a couple that I can put out there. One, you talked about a goal of increasing union membership and increasing worker power as the objectives of this report. And as you know, that there was an election earlier this year in Bessemer, Alabama, at an Amazon warehouse. There's been, the election was contested, and it's going through the process of deciding whether there'll be a new election. And ultimately, if the final decision is that there is a new election, how would that be different, given what you've done in the report, than the first election?
I mean, my hope would be that it's different in that Amazon in this case is on notice that some of the practices that went on during that election, like the mailbox in the parking lot, were not just borderline, were overwhelmingly coercive, and that folks may remember that President Biden filmed a video during that organizing drive. He didn't mention Amazon, but he said it should be up to the workers to be able to choose a union free from fear, intimidation, or coercion. And I think I was still working in the labor movement before moving over to the administration. In the labor movement, that video, I think, made waves, because we've just never seen such a clear articulation from a recent Democratic president, Obama, Clinton, or Carter, of the value of a worker being able to choose fairly. And I think one of the things the vice president and the president regularly invoked from the NLRA is that it's the policy of the United States to not to not only have unions, but to encourage union membership. That's in the statute. So I think Professor Silvia, if there's another election, it'll show a NLRB, a National Labor Relations Board, that is following the law, but is also giving workers in the U.S. South, with the largest, most powerful company, another shot at fairly and freely making their own choice there. And even with that, understanding it's still an uphill battle at a place like Amazon with turnover but I think since we are in Striketober, the interesting thing for me is I think one of the challenges at Amazon with that workforce is it's been a long time for workers to see other folks standing up and winning. And I think this is what's interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement and the links between labor and civil rights, in that, when Black Lives Matter really took off, even more so last summer, things started to change in a really fundamental way, where, we reached this tipping point that we hadn't been to before. As you said, I grew up in Richmond. Statues of white supremacists started coming down in Richmond last summer. And I think one of the interesting things about these strikes, and the UAW has 10,000 members on strike right now at John Deere. There's a potential strike in the entertainment industry coming up. There's a food and bakery worker strike at Kellogg's right now. Is if workers see other workers standing up and winning, I think that starts to change their own equation about taking the risk to organize a union or vote for a union. We saw that in the sort of Red for Ed movement in education when I was at AFT and after I left. But this is what's interesting for me now, is given the sort of labor market dynamics, this growing group of strikes, is if there is another election in Amazon, will these workers, put themselves in the line, not just for pay, but for a decent workplace where, they can do things like go to the bathroom or take a break, a meal break. And my younger brother had a foster child who was an older kid, 18 or 19, who worked in one of those Amazon warehouses around Christmas time in Richmond. And this worker, Brandon, explained to me, how exhausting it was, mentally and physically exhausting. And this is a kid who went on to go into the Marines, so he's not some shrinking violet. And I think, the Amazon fight will be one that will be fascinating to watch if there is a kind of reset of the playing field in favor of workers, not getting the full scale blitz of intimidation, sort of anti-union campaigning.
Thank you. So we're still looking for some questions from people who are watching. I do have a second question. When we had our discussion on Wednesday with Harold Meyerson, I think one thing that was consensus is that it's very unlikely that the PRO Act is going to pass. And so the question that I have is, have people interested in labor affairs in the administration, do they have any plan B on how to advance some of the things that were in the PRO Act, given that it doesn't look like the PRO Act as an entire piece of legislation is going to go forward?
I think being back in labor now, I can say this, that the hope is that parts of the PRO Act will pass in the reconciliation bill, and that if the calculus of employers changes about firing a worker who's a lead organizer or crossing the line in terms of the anti-union consultants, that may start to change the equation. I think the task force and the recommendations that are going to come out include a lot of more robust actions through executive order that will be meaningful, both for the federal government as a direct employer and then as a procurer of government services, and focused on things like furthering economy and efficiency for the federal government as a purchaser. So while the task force was never intended as a substitute to the PRO Act, I think it's going to go back to the original statement that the president and vice president made, that in every way possible, they're going to lead and push this administration to be the most pro-union in our history. And one of the things the vice president said is, there's no action or no measure on the part of the executive branch and any of the departments that's too big or too small. This is obviously the biggest and most important. But in the first meeting I had with her, we were going through labor history, and I was telling her how meaningful it was for me to talk to her about labor history and things like Frances Perkins being the first female cabinet secretary when I'm talking to the first female vice president. And she was really interested in digging in, as someone who really wants to master a subject, the people and the policy. She wanted to dig in more about why there was a pronounced dip in union density starting in the late 70s. And she obviously knew about PATCO and the strike in the 80s. But we started talking about and having lived through the Employee Free Choice Act, I feel like I know what this was like for the folks in the late 70s. But in the late 70s, there was an effort to pass labor law reform with President Carter. And I think they were they were 2 votes short of reaching closure. And she really wanted to find out more about what happened there. And I think like we're at a similar moment today. Again, I mean, union density went up last year, but it's just because workers who had a union had more of a voice in a pandemic economy, and they weren't left out in the cold as many as non-union workers. But this goes to your question about Amazon, Professor Silvia. We can't, the current system is so wildly broken. I mean, the Amazon example is one. There was another recent one of a sort of vegan meat company in Asheville where the workers were trying to organize. And I think it was Huffington Post who got the transcripts of the anti-union consultant. And it's just, it's wildly chilling, some of the messages they have for workers about, what would happen to them if they voted for a union. And this is a quote, good company, a company trying to promote, healthy eating and healthy agriculture. So I think, just to say that, the PRO Act is not going to go away as a necessary solve. And one of the things that's interesting for me here in Ohio is to watch, a Senate race where we'll have an open Senate seat. And you have a congressman from Youngstown named Tim Ryan, who's a very emphatic pro-union, PRO Act legislator who's running for Senate. If he could, be paired together with a Sherrod Brown, and we could start to sort of build, more momentum in the Senate, I think, the need for the PRO Act isn't going away, and the organizing will continue there.
Great, thanks. So I see Philip had his hand up, and so if you could ask your question, Philip, that'd be great. Be useful if you'd tell us a little bit about yourself, just briefly.
Oh, I actually am abusing this a little bit because it's more comment than question, but hopefully I'll get a reaction.
Just keep it short, that's all I want.
I'm with the American Postal Workers Union, Manager of Negotiation Support, and I wanted to make a comment about the union density problem. And I don't know if you've looked at this, but the comparability issue is critical. When you have heavy union density, wages and benefits are largely taken out of competition.
Right.
Employers and companies have to compete on other things than labor rates. And in our own case with the Postal Service, by statute, we have a comparability language with the private sector. And as the private sector declines and fails to keep up with inflation and the buying power, and we try to maintain that, we have a harder and harder time doing so because the comparabilities are not that great. We can find some good ones, but they're thin compared to what we used to find 20 years ago.
Right.
One other thing is the contacts at DOL. It's extremely difficult for us. And I know at the AFL-CIO, other affiliates said the same thing, to make contacts with people in the DOL and actually get input and get questions answered. We represent some private sector drivers that are under the wage determinations, and we can't get information on the determination of the wage determinations and it's a special determination for mail haul. And we can't get answers on that.
Philip, I'm happy to help on the DOL side. I mean, Marty Walsh is the first DOL secretary who's been a union member since, I think, the Nixon administration or the Ford administration in 40 years. He's a building trades member. Each cabinet secretary had a staff designee who served, day to day and did the real work on the task force. The DOL designee is a guy named Josh Orton, who's a senior advisor to Marty Walsh. I'm happy to connect you with him. On your broader point about standards and kind of taking wages and benefits off the table, I think this is why the push by a union like SEIU around sectoral bargaining is so interesting and so necessary, because you're exactly right. If we're competing, and we live this in the building trades every day, if we're competing against the low road contractors of the world, and their competitive advantage is cutting corners, that's not sustainable. So that's absolutely a reason we need a stronger kind of floor there. And again, the other thing, just living here in the Midwest, I don't know if the folks on the call saw the report that was out about a week ago called Factory Towns, which looked at, the fall in manufacturing in smaller towns, so towns of about 30,000 people, and what that has meant for electoral politics, in that the areas in the Midwest and 10 states in the Midwest that have been hit hardest by deindustrialization, think of, the GM plant in Youngstown closing, have seen the biggest swing in favor of, a radical right-wing populist like Donald Trump, and folks looking for an outlet there. But the other thing that the report points out is that 97%, I think, of the loss of union jobs that's happened over the last 8 years, from 12 to 20, have occurred in those states and in those cities. So it's not just that we need the standards to prevent, low road employers and the collapse of the middle class. As a democracy, as a government now, and a people who are facing a fork in the road between autocracy and democracy, labor as a public good, as a voice and a forum for agency of workers, as a bulwark against right-wing insanity, and as an ability for the government to function and elect people who have a public good in mind. Labor is critical in those places. And one place that jumped out for me, labor, every election has its own program where we communicate with our members and turn them out to vote for endorsed candidates. I think 5 years into my service at the AFL-CIO, I was sent to Green Bay, Wisconsin in 2006. Green Bay for me, again, is a place that I think has just been crushed by deindustrialization and a labor movement that's a shell of itself. And obviously that has big implications for Wisconsin and who Wisconsin votes for president and in Congress as well. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the comment, Philip.
Thanks a lot. I'll go to Jeff Wheeler. He got his question in the chat, second in the queue. So Jeff, who's a member of our board, go right ahead.
Great, thanks, Steve. So I'm now a director of a supply chain project funded by iLab, but I was the president of the union of AFG Local 12 for a couple of years, negotiating a new collective bargaining agreement under the Trump administration. One thing we discovered is that a lot of the core functions in many government agencies have been subcontracted out. So they're no longer being done, and I think to the detriment to the quality of public service. And secondly, there's been a redefinition of jobs within the federal sector, taking a lot of jobs out of the bargaining units, quite a few. With any kind of supervisory indicia have been taken out. So the coverage for the bargaining unit in the federal sector has shrunk quite a bit. Yep. And a lot of the core functions have already been contracted out. So I'm wondering if there's going to be steps to analyze, evaluate, and correct that.
Absolutely. And without jumping in front of the report's release next Saturday, I think you'll see a number of executive orders across different sectors. But your point, Jeff, about subcontracting and the federal government being a model employer, both in terms of who's in the unit and how they walk the walk in directly hiring employers, is going to be addressed in an executive order that you'll see very soon. So, but that was from your union, AFGE, the other federal sector unions. That was something we heard loud and clear. It's not just that there were 835,000 workers represented by unions, but not in the union, who were in the bargaining unit, but not in the union. It was, as you said, there's been this sort of gradual whittling down of labor's voice and kind of critical mass in the federal government. So one of the action items, executive orders, is definitely aimed at correcting for that problem. And thank you for highlighting.
I would just note that it's in the Foreign Service as well as the GS jobs. Right.
Yep. And we saw that when we went deeper on the data of where that was happening, because when the vice president asked about Google's workforce and what was the breakout between contractors and temporary workers and employees, she asked for the data on the federal side too. And I think the trend there was definitely, it's not surprising, but it is disturbing, as you highlight.
Okay, thanks. I generally like to stick to the order in the queue, but if Steve doesn't mind, I'd like to hear from Petra Hansen from the Swedish embassy. So Petra, if you could ask your question, that'd be great.
Thank you very much. Hi, yes, I'm a counselor with the Swedish Embassy here in Washington, D.C. And it's very interesting to listen to your presentation. Many thanks for meeting with us today. So just very briefly, if you could say something about how us in Europe can engage in this, very critical time in the United States when things are looking to take a turn for a change, and how, not being perfect countries, but having a lot of experience in this field and feeling that we have unions that have modernized, that have become more feminized, adaptive to changes in society, to automation, to innovation. We are an industrial country as well, and we have had our own rust belts that are now slowly vitalizing, but we care very deeply, of course, about the electoral patterns that you mentioned and democracy in the United States, because for obvious reasons, it's a key aspect for us in all of Europe, as for the rest of the world. But it's also linked a little bit to our own industrial base and our own possibilities to create employment and growth in our own countries. I don't want to hide that the whole Buy American content topic is tricky for us, because somehow it appears to it would perhaps allow for unionized jobs in Europe, and companies that are working very hard on the green transition and decent work agenda, and maybe being top in the class in that regard, being shut out from this very large market. Whereas Asian partners might not face the same trouble, depending on what they produce. So if you could say something, thank you.
Sure, and thank you for the question. And I think you highlight, Petra, a really important area. Now that I'm wearing my union hat again as a union staffer, I think the first benefit of the contrast in your country and in Europe and in other countries with high union density is it's an immediate rebuttal to the talking point of the right wing or the anti-union crowd, that we can't have unions in the competitive economy, that unions and strong companies don't coexist, even though there are plenty of good strong union companies in the United States in the private sector. That you all have companies that are heavily unionized, where workers not only have a voice on the factory floor or in the field, they have a voice on the board too. So it's both your alternative model is both a rebuttal and a way forward for labor here, whether it's sectoral bargaining, as we talked about before, or co-determination. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us in the United States now, where we have a senator like Elizabeth Warren who's pushed for worker voice on the board, on the corporate board and in the boardroom, and that a company won't fall apart if they have a rank and file worker bringing that perspective and that institutional memory into the boardroom. So I think the other big challenge for us within labor now is, how do we work more closely with our counterparts in highly unionized countries to really raise standards at companies who operate one way in Europe and another way in the United States. Now, Professor Silvia talked about the car companies. That's obviously a big focus of the UAW now, and this idea of a just transition for electrical vehicles and making sure those are good union jobs. But the need to organize the Toyotas and Nissans and Volkswagens of the world hasn't gone away. One of the others that we've seen in the construction industry is Skanska, the big Swedish company, is huge construction contractor who operate with robust worker protections in Scandinavia and in some parts of Europe, but in the UK and the United States, hire non-union, have low road contractors they do business with, have workers who sometimes are injured or killed on the job. So just to say that we as a labor movement need to think much more internationally about how we engage these companies. And we've started to do that at Skanska on the construction side with our brother and sister unions in Scandinavia and in UK. But there's a heck of a lot more work to do. And I'll just close by saying, there's another Scandinavian company called Ørsted. I think it's a Norwegian company that is coming into the US now and doing a lot of work around wind farms and building building the actual wind turbine facility and then constructing it off the coast. Ørsted is the sort of the counterexample to Skanska in that they approached very early on labor in the United States, the construction unions, the manufacturing unions, and said, how can we really work as a model employer for these new energy jobs and making green jobs good union jobs? And they've really led by example there. And we need more of that in terms of international cooperation. In terms of the Made in America executive order, I think that is something that actually there's a colleague of mine, Celeste Drake, who's heading that up within OMB. I think for us politically here in the United States, and just wearing my Midwestern hat in Cleveland, it's almost like an inoculation tool to be able to talk to a lot of Trump voters and to say, in a time where we have a supply chain that's disrupted, in a time where we have our industrial core hollowed out, are there ways that the federal government can get a better bang for its buck, more economy and efficiency in purchasing if we bring more industrial capacity home or more supply chain home closer, and also helps us competitively in terms of competing against other countries. But I think you're right in that there's a balance here too, and that we don't want to set back our international relationships or the work that we just talked about that needs to be done on the labor front with an order that could be overly broad or prescriptive. But I think it's really a reaction to 40 years of outsourcing and deindustrialization, and Democratic and Republican administrations, frankly, who've cared very little about keeping or promoting good jobs here in the United States in that area. But thank you for the points you raised, and good to connect.
Okay, Steve Slane's been patient, so Steve, you can ask a question, then it'll be followed by John Russo, who's put something in the text box, so we can elaborate once we've had Steve's question. So Steve, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve. Great presentation, Dan. Ørsted is a Danish company, and you and I had a number of conversations with them, and they are a great company, and they adopted a responsible contractor policy. And so one of the areas where you've been a real leader in the labor movement for many, many years is in the whole capital strategies area. Was that a subject of the panel, or? And I also see that Secretary Walsh has corrected some of the egregious things that happened under Trump, making it more difficult to invest money with a responsible viewpoint. So can you just talk a little bit about how unions view responsible investing and some of the work that you did with around infrastructure and getting responsible contractor policies in place?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that really happened even before the task force was stood up was that, in the American Rescue Plan, there was a very robust relief for multi-employer, meaning union pension funds, who've been, decimated by employers withdrawing or investment losses or sort of changing demographics in their industry. And that was, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 billion or so for the fraction of the 25% or so of union plans that are pension funds where workers can take their pension from job to job within an industry, a multi-employer plan that really needed help and relief. So the base from which we worked from was stronger because of that multi-employer relief. On the standard side and kind of following the money, yes, absolutely. I think the federal government is a enormous procurer and contractor with private sector companies, and this goes back to the conversation around sectoral bargaining and kind of standard setting. But this will absolutely be part of the set of executive orders that are due out in about 8 days. And I think on the construction side, on the union construction side, Steve, as you said, responsible contractors for policies, RCPs for us were really ways to set the standard for investors or investment firms about how they operate in infrastructure construction. On the federal government side, that's really done through something called, one way the federal government can lead on that is through a project labor agreement, a pre-hire collective bargaining agreement. And I think, again, in furtherance of better economy efficiency, labor peace, labor productivity, one of the other things that's underway is a much stronger, more robust executive order around project labor agreements and what projects are covered by that executive order. And lastly, Steve, as you said, and we worked on this in the Obama administration, there was a big effort under the Trump administration to roll back factoring in things like environmental, social, or governance issues into investments and the risk they pose and the opportunities they pose. And 2 days ago, the Department of Labor updated its guidance there for pension funds to be able to take those factors into account more robustly. And most promising for me that the Congress is really taking up a bill to make that something that's in statute, as opposed to this ping pong match we get into between administrations where it's rolled back or it's advanced too. But thank you for the question.
Great. So John has an interesting question that he's put in the box. So John, if you could say just one sentence about yourself so that Dan will know where you're coming from, and then proceed with your question.
I'm from Youngstown.
Northeastern Ohio, brother.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I'm currently retired, but a visiting research fellow at Georgetown's Kamala Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor.
Great.
And if you're not getting working class perspectives, we also have a wonderful blog that's 40 times a year.
We love Joe McCartan and Stephen Lerner, John, among the other folks.
Yeah.
That,
Good guys. Good guys. This question really floats off part of what Harold had said the other day we were talking about, and that recent statistics show that workers, and largely essential workers, are quitting and or refusing to work. In essence, a type of strike. And it seems like unions seem paralyzed in terms of how to respond. They're not responding to this, in essence, a non-union strike wave, as it's been called. What do you hear that they're doing?
I mean, I'd love to hear more about where you see labor being paralyzed, but I think one with this wave of strikes this week in particular, I think one calculation that the bakery workers, the auto workers, the entertainment workers are making is it's going to be harder for John Deere or a studio company or Kellogg to hire replacement workers while they're out on strike. And that's one way I hope labor is taking advantage of this moment. I think it would be terrible if we miss this opportunity, because what is happening here is this is a form of collective action by workers who are saying, we're not going to put our safety and health, our ability to come home to our families at the end of the day on the line for a job where they don't have proper safety protocols or respect for workers. So I think this is another example of a changing moment, a changing landscape. And one of the things that Vice President really was focused on was that we're in this new era, this new epoch of obviously COVID, but what COVID has brought. And this is one really important development. And I think it's, as you said, it is a type of a strike. And I think labor should be embracing this. And if it means more strikes by workers who feel like they're not getting the right contract and the right collective bargaining agreement by their union, I hope the folks who are essential workers know that that's one form of collective action, but that membership in a union is a much more robust way to have a voice on the job and security in the job too. But I'd love to hear more where you see it not working or labor not embracing it enough. But that's something we should address straight away.
Yeah, I think. Well, my own view is that given the labor law, given the inability of the Democrats back in the 60s when you had Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic President, in the 70s when you had a Democratic President, Democratic House, and 1992 when you had a Democratic Senate, House, you couldn't get any labor law reform.
2009.
And now, yeah, you're ahead of me, okay? In 2009. So there's a long history that the legislative actions in this country are not conducive to organizing.
Right.
And employers are very sophisticated, of course, since the mid-1970s and how in terms of deunionization. Where part of the real action has been in recent years has been the types of organizing in the community and organizing of different types of strategies. And you and I both involved in various types of corporate campaigns. And here you have today a large group of people that have been identified because of the pandemic as essential,
right,
and important. And they are exercising their right by saying, I'm not going to go to work in a workplace that's not safe. I'm not going to go to a workplace that's not doesn't pay very much. One of my choices is to withdraw.
right. Vote with your feet, right.
Yeah, and with their feet. And the question is, I've been going over the newspapers and magazines to see what unions are saying about this. And if maybe you know some sources that I don't, but there's not much being said. And it seems like this would be a really good time to organize.
I completely agree. And John, I'll follow up with you after this. Steve Slay and I have a colleague in common whose name is Damon Silvers. You may know Damon.
Yep.
He wrote he's the policy director at the AFL-CIO and now serving the new AFL-CIO president, Liz Schuler. Damon wrote something very interesting about this, where he pointed to this trend and the rise of essential workers, stepping back as a critical moment that workers need to that unions need to embrace and further. So I think at least from the kind of bigger federation perspective, he identified that as something very important and meaningful and an opportunity. I think the other opportunity here too is, again, this goes to your point about the kind of arc of history and thinking about the 60s and 70s and the Powell letter in the 70s and the PATCO strike in the 80s. Labor is at a point now, at least publicly, where the support for unions is at a 10 or 20 year high. I think there's 72% overall support for labor. There's support from a plurality of Republicans. This is why, for me, it's interesting in a place like Ohio to have observed 10 years ago when Scott Walker pushed through his anti-public employee measures in Wisconsin. Governor Kasich tried the same thing here in Ohio. He won legislatively, but then lost at the ballot box. He got overwhelmingly rejected at the ballot box. Missouri, of all places, 2 or 3 years ago, overturned right to work. But I think that the public sees the fact that people are taken advantage of, and people don't have a voice at work. That could mean the difference between them, being alive or dead. And I'll send you this piece from Damon, but I think I've seen parts of labor embrace it. If other parts of labor are missing the boat here, I think that's a real missed opportunity, to your point.
So with the very end, I want to give Ariana wrote a very interesting thing in the chat. Ariana, do you want to say something quickly about that?
Yes. Sorry. I just, I think the COVID recession has been very gender focused, and I really appreciate John's question about workers voting with their feet. The majority of essential workers are women, and childcare and care difficulties are a big factor in women or workers at the moment not returning to work. Yep. So I'm just wondering what your views are on how the unions could more explicitly address this, whether they are doing it, and how we can explicitly address the gender impacts of COVID.
Great question. I mean, Ariane, this is something the vice president is very, very focused on. It's one of her, 10 assignments for the president, but this is why in the reconciliation bill, support for not only, childcare and after school care is a critical part of the sort of dollar amount. It's as you say, it's the key to people being able to go back to work and feel like the folks who are taking care of their loved ones are properly paid, properly trained, and properly supported. So in terms of unions advocating around this and using this as to meet people where they are, the two unions in particular, I think, have done an excellent job of using this issue, not just because it's the right thing to do, but in order to organize this industry, which is unbelievably low wage and low road in terms of some of the actors. SEIU, the Service Employees Union, and AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, both of whom represent childcare workers in some states, have been the most robust voice. And I heard them with the vice president make this case for a real federal investment in supporting workers being able to have access to affordable childcare and affordable elder care. So I think that work has started to happen, but the critical thing will be right now, as the reconciliation bill hangs in the balance and the Democrats decide whether to go all in on a few big issues like the child tax credit, or spread it out among other key areas like childcare and infrastructure. Will this get to our point about the legislature reflecting the will of the American people and doing the public good? Will this be part of the reconciliation bill? I know that the American Families Plan, I know this is a huge priority for the vice president and the president. They've stuck by it, but the proof will be in the pudding in terms of what's voted on and what's enacted at the end of this year. So, but you're exactly right. Like, this is when I worked for AFT President Randy Weingarten, American Federation of Teachers. She would say over and over and over again, labor and community have to march arm in arm. This is why the Chicago teachers were so effective in winning strikes there, and that they viewed community as the new density. And it's why, in some places like St. Paul, Minnesota, teachers, when they're bargaining a contract, brought parents to the bargaining table, brought community members to the bargaining table. If we're not furthering the public interest in those community needs and meeting the needs of those workers, we're failing as union leaders and as union advocates. So you've hit on, I think, the most critical issue right now in terms of making this economy not just more functional, but fair as well on the childcare side.
Yeah, and with that, Steve, I think we're pretty close to being done. I want to thank you, Steve Silvia, for hosting, moderating. This has been terrific. Dan, fantastic presentation. We'll be watching the headlines to see how it unfolds. So the report will be released in the next week. Is that right?
The next week, exactly. October 23rd. So next Saturday would be 180 days from the day the executive order was signed. So yeah.
Fantastic. Super. Folks, join us next Wednesday. We're going to have Chantel Sheeks and Mark Friedman from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They might have a slightly different point of view than Dan, but it will be an interesting conversation. I want to thank everybody for joining DC Lera. And again, thank you, Dan Pedrotty and Steve Silvia.
Thanks to you all too. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Dan. Great conversation.
Bye.